Left Behind, the story of two siblings who overcame abandonment and found their true family. The unimaginable beginning. It was a quiet morning at St. Joseph's Medical Center, where the routine hustle and bustle of a typical delivery day was underway. The sterile white lights of the hospital hallways flickered softly as new life was about to be ushered into the world. In room 215, a moment of life-changing significance was unfolding. The cries of two newborn babies filled the room, their voices trembling through the air, reverberating across the walls. Hannah and Ethan, twins, one boy, one girl, entered the world under the care of experienced nurses, their small hands stretching out towards one another instinctively. Wrapped in soft hospital blankets, their dark skin, smooth and flawless, shimmered under the fluorescent lights. The nurses smiled as they carefully tended to the newborns, handling them with delicate care, as if they had been waiting for these little lives for eternity. For most parents, this would have been a joyous moment, meeting the children they had waited 9 months to welcome. But for John and Emily Foster, the moment was filled with dread, disbelief, and confusion. The joy they had anticipated was replaced with a shocking reality they hadn't prepared for. John, standing rigid beside his wife, stared at the infants with wide eyes. His face turned pale, his hands clenching involuntarily at his sides. He couldn't understand what was happening, what had gone wrong. His wife Emily was already trembling, her hands hovering in the air, as though unable to touch the babies in front of her. She felt as if the room were spinning, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. "They're beautiful," one of the nurses said softly, trying to calm the tense atmosphere, but her words were met with silence. Emily couldn't respond. Her lips quivered, and her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. John looked at his wife, searching for some sort of reassurance, but found none. His mind raced, and an icy feeling of disbelief overwhelmed him. He looked back at the babies, two perfect children, yet somehow they did not fit into the world he and Emily had imagined. Their skin, so dark against the pale tones of their own, felt foreign, as though they didn't belong to the couple who had brought them into the world. The confusion and distress overwhelmed John, and he stood there paralyzed, staring down at his children. Emily hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She reached out a trembling hand, but when her fingers brushed against the soft blanket wrapping Ethan, she pulled back quickly, as though burned. The reality of the situation set in. These children were not what she had expected. Her heart pounded as she looked at the two babies, so small, so perfect in their own right. But in her eyes, they were a shocking contradiction to everything she had imagined. She had envisioned a picture-perfect family, and this moment did not align with her expectations. The babies, so innocent, so full of life, had been born with a color that shocked her. It didn't fit her preconceived notion of what her child should look like. She stumbled backward, and her breath caught in her throat. John looked at her, his own shock mirrored in her eyes. Neither spoke for what felt like hours, even though mere minutes passed. The tension between them grew unbearable. John turned to the nurse, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and urgency. "We need time," he said, his tone hardening with a finality that surprised even him. "We need time to think about this." Emily barely moved. She stood motionless, her body frozen in fear. The nurse, sensing the intense emotions swirling in the room, gave them space, but her concern was evident. This was a moment none of them had anticipated. Emily's voice barely rose above a whisper. I can't hold them. I just need a moment. Just a moment. With that, she turned away, leaving the room to stand in the sterile, cold hallway. The cries of her children echoed through the corridor, but they fell on deaf ears. No one came to soothe the newborns, and they were placed back in the nursery, alone and vulnerable. That night, after hours of silence and deliberation, the decision was made. John and Emily sat in a sterile waiting room, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. They stared blankly at the papers before them, legal documents that would sever their rights as parents to the very children they had given life to hours before. I can't do this, Emily whispered, her voice cracking under the pressure, but her words were lost in the silence between them. John was silent too, his eyes fixed on the papers that felt as though they were mocking him. Do we have a choice? John's voice was hollow. His hands trembled as he signed the forms that would give up all rights to his children. The weight of his decision sank in, but it was too late. The paper was signed. Emily followed suit, her hands shaky as she wrote her name on the dotted line. She didn't know how to feel anymore. Pain, regret, and fear coursed through her veins. But it was done. They had made the choice. They had abandoned their children. As the last page was signed, a nurse entered the room with a sympathetic look on her face. She watched them, her heart heavy with the understanding that there was nothing she could do to undo what had been done. Hannah and Ethan, their beautiful children, were now orphans in the eyes of the law. The next day, the news of the abandoned triplets spread throughout the hospital. Whispers echoed in the hallways, some of the staff talking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the situation. Some felt pity for the babies. Others whispered about the shame of the parents who couldn't accept the children they had brought into the world. Hannah and Ethan lay together in a crib, their tiny bodies intertwined, as though instinctively seeking comfort from each other. They were nameless, unloved, and unwanted by the two people who should have protected them the most. Their cries filled the empty rooms, but no one answered. The nurses did their best, holding them in their arms, whispering soft lullabies, trying to fill the void left by the abandonment. But it wasn't enough. The babies needed more than just strangers' care, more than just sympathy. They needed love, and for now, it seemed as if that love would remain elusive. But despite everything, Hannah and Ethan were not broken. Their bond, stronger than their circumstances, remained intact, and they clung to each other in the face of all that had been taken from them. Their journey was just beginning, and the world would soon learn that love could come from the most unexpected places. The Miller family's long-awaited decision. Alice and Mark Miller sat side by side in their cozy living room, the soft flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. The sound of the clock ticking echoed in the background, marking the passage of another moment in their lives. A quiet unease lingered in the air, but this time, it wasn't the usual silence of a couple who had been trying and failing for years to have children of their own. No, this time, the silence was filled with anticipation. For Alice and Mark, the journey to parenthood had been nothing short of heart-wrenching. Year after year, they had prayed, hoping that somehow a miracle would occur. But after multiple miscarriages and failed attempts at adoption, they had finally come to terms with the painful reality that they would never have a biological child. The dream of raising a child seemed like an impossible one. But then, one evening, everything changed. Mark was flipping through the local news on his tablet when an article caught his eye. It was a story about the abandonment of twin babies, Hannah and Ethan, who had been left behind at birth by their biological parents because of their skin color. The story, written with sensitivity and sorrow, spoke of the twins' unfortunate beginning in life. They had been left without love, rejected by the very people who should have cherished them. The weight of the story hit Alice and Mark hard. They had been dreaming of children for so long, and now, here were two children in need of a family that could offer them the love they deserved. Alice looked at Mark, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mark, we have to do something. We can give them a home. We can give them everything we never had the chance to give." Mark's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "But, Alice, they're not like us. The world will judge them. The world will judge us. Are we ready for that?" Alice's voice trembled, but she spoke with determination. "We're ready. We can't let these children grow up without love. They need us, and we need them." The decision was made. With a sense of urgency, Alice and Mark contacted the adoption agency. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to open their hearts and their home to Hannah and Ethan, the two children whose lives had already been marked by pain and rejection. A few weeks later, Alice and Mark stood nervously in the nursery of St. Joseph's Medical Center. The twins, Hannah and Ethan, were ready to go home. The moment they saw them, Hannah's wide eyes filled with curiosity and Ethan's gentle smile. They knew, without a doubt, that these were the children meant for them. The hospital staff, who had cared for the twins in their early days, watched with tender smiles as Alice and Mark gently lifted their new children from the crib. Hannah and Ethan, though nervous, reached out instinctively toward their new parents, finding comfort in the warmth of their embrace. As Alice cradled Hannah and Mark held Ethan, they felt a rush of love, the kind they had been waiting for all their lives. It was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them, a chapter filled with unknowns, but also with immense potential for healing, joy, and love. The journey home was a quiet one, with only the soft sound of the car engine filling the space. Alice and Mark exchanged nervous glances, both aware that their lives had just changed forever. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they knew they were taking the first step toward building something beautiful. The Miller family's new life together was filled with moments of joy. In their home, there was laughter, love, and warmth. Mark and Alice showered Hannah and Ethan with all the love they had to give. They watched with pride as their children took their first steps, said their first words, and grew into kind, loving individuals. But outside the walls of their home, things were different. The world was not as accepting as Alice and Mark had hoped. The stares, the whispers, the judgments, they were all there, lurking in the background. At the grocery store, Alice pushed the shopping cart down the aisles, glancing nervously at the other shoppers. She could feel the stares, the looks that lingered a little too long, the hushed voices that seemed to follow her every move. "Is that really her child?" one person whispered under their breath. "How did they adopt them? Where did they come from?" Each time, Alice felt a knot form in her stomach. She had expected some questions, but the weight of the prejudice was overwhelming. At school, the questions were even more direct. Hannah, now 4 years old, had started to pick up on the stares. She would ask her mother why she didn't look like the other kids. "Why are we so different, Mommy?" she asked one day, her voice small and unsure. Alice swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She knew this day would come, but she wasn't prepared for the pain it brought. "We're not different, sweetheart. We just look a little different from other people. But that's okay. You're special, and we love you just the way you are." It was the same with Ethan, who had started asking similar questions. He would look at himself in the mirror, puzzled, as if trying to make sense of his identity. The weight of being different began to affect both children, and their innocence was slowly replaced with doubt. Alice and Mark did their best to shield them from the harsh realities of the world. They filled their home with love and affirmation, but they couldn't control how others saw their family, and it hurt. It hurt to see their children struggle with something they didn't understand. Despite the challenges they faced, Alice and Mark's love for Hannah and Ethan only grew stronger. They refused to let the prejudice from others define their family. They were determined to create an environment where their children felt safe, loved, and proud of who they were. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the conversation turned to identity. Hannah, now 6, looked up at her parents with wide eyes. "Will people always look at us like we're different?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Mark, always the rock of the family, took a deep breath. "Hannah, people might look at us and wonder, but what matters is what's in here," he said, pointing to his heart. "We are a family, and nothing can ever change that. We are strong together, and we love each other. That's all that matters." Alice smiled at him, feeling the strength of their bond. She looked at Ethan, who was busy drawing on a piece of paper. "Your daddy's right. We might look different from others, but that doesn't mean we're any less of a family. We are more than enough just the way we are." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the message was clear. Their family, though unconventional to some, was filled with love and unity. Hannah and Ethan, who had once struggled to understand their place in the world, were slowly coming to terms with their identity. They were part of a family that had chosen them, a family that loved them beyond measure. As the evening drew to a close, Mark and Alice exchanged a knowing look. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world would continue to challenge them, but they would face it together, with love as their guide. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by commitment, and by the strength of their hearts. Growing up in love, but not the same. Hannah and Ethan grew up surrounded by love, and it was clear from the very beginning that they were cherished by their adoptive parents, Alice and Mark. Their home was a warm, welcoming place, filled with laughter, support, and a deep sense of family. From their first steps to their first words, everything felt like a dream come true. For Alice and Mark, they had finally found the joy they had longed for, and the children, in return, gave them everything they needed: love, laughter, and a sense of purpose. At first, Hannah and Ethan didn't notice the world outside their family's embrace. They were young, and the world felt safe within the walls of their home. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. They didn't see the color of their skin as a problem, nor did they question why they didn't look like their parents. They were simply happy to be together. However, as they grew older, the world around them began to change. The innocence of childhood faded, and the reality of being different began to settle in. They started noticing the glances from strangers and the subtle questions that no one had asked when they were younger. It was a quiet discomfort at first, the sort of thing that Hannah and Ethan couldn't quite place, but it was there, always present in the background. The first time the question came, it wasn't malicious. Ethan had been playing with a group of kids at school, and one of the boys, who had been watching him closely, finally asked, "Why don't you look like your parents?" Ethan froze. He had never considered this before. Why didn't he look like Alice and Mark? The question lingered in his mind, but he didn't know how to answer. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just an innocent question. But the boy's gaze lingered a little too long, and Ethan could feel the difference in the air. It was as if his skin, darker than the others, was something that didn't fit, something that set him apart in a way that made him feel uneasy. Later that day, when he got home, he asked Alice, "Mom, why do I look different from you and Dad?" Alice had been expecting this question, but it still hurt to hear. She knelt down beside Ethan, looking into his eyes, her heart aching. "Ethan, sweetheart, we may not look the same on the outside, but what matters is the love we have for each other. We chose you, and you are ours, no matter what anyone says." But even with her words of reassurance, Ethan could still feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. His identity was beginning to shift, and he didn't know how to navigate this new understanding of himself. As time went on, the questions didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent and more pointed. At school, Hannah found herself surrounded by a group of curious classmates who couldn't help but ask about her family. "Do you live with your real parents?" one of the girls asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and confusion. Hannah smiled nervously. "Yes, I do. Alice and Mark are my real parents." The girl didn't look convinced. "But you don't look like them," she said, looking at Hannah's dark skin, her tone innocently skeptical. "Are you adopted?" For the first time, Hannah felt embarrassed. She nodded quietly, not knowing how to explain the complexity of her story to a child who didn't understand. The truth of her adoption had never seemed so alien until that moment. It was like a label that had suddenly been placed on her, something that made her feel like she didn't fully belong, even though she had always considered herself part of this family. Later that night, after dinner, Hannah sat beside Ethan on the couch, her face troubled. "Ethan," she said softly, "why do people always ask about our parents? It's like they don't understand we belong here, with Alice and Mark." Ethan didn't say anything at first, his face serious as he looked at the ground. Finally, he muttered, "I don't know. I feel like we're different, and I don't know how to explain it." Hannah looked at him, her eyes searching for answers. "Do you think we're not enough? Do you think people see us as different because we don't look like them?" Ethan shook his head, his voice tight. "I don't know, but sometimes it feels like we're not enough, no matter how much they love us." As the years passed, these moments of discomfort began to weigh more heavily on Hannah and Ethan. At school, they learned to ignore the sideways glances and the whispered conversations that followed them. But the damage had already been done. The questions had planted seeds of doubt in their hearts. Their classmates didn't understand why they didn't look like their parents, and the teachers, though kind, never quite seemed to address the underlying tension. It wasn't overt racism, but it was there in every sideways glance, in every innocent question. It was the quiet discomfort of being different in a world that didn't always accept difference. One day, after a particularly tough week of bullying, Hannah and Ethan found themselves sitting together on the swings in the playground, staring at the ground. The sounds of children playing around them faded into the background as they tried to process their emotions. Hannah broke the silence. Do you ever feel like we're the problem? Like, maybe we're not supposed to be here? With Alice and Mark? Ethan looked at her, his expression hard. No, we're meant to be here. I know that. But it doesn't change how people treat us. Sometimes, I wish things were different. I wish I could just be like everyone else. The weight of their words settled heavily between them. They had everything they needed. Love, support, a family that cared for them. But the world outside their home was not as kind. And no matter how hard Alice and Mark tried to shield them from it, the questions, the looks, and the doubt remained. At home, Alice and Mark did their best to comfort their children. They reassured them every night, telling them they were perfect, just as they were. But even the warmth of their love couldn't shield them from the reality of a world that didn't understand. Alice, one evening, sat down with Hannah, brushing her hair gently. I know it's hard, she said, her voice soft. But what other people think doesn't change who we are. You are my daughter. Ethan is my son. We chose you because we love you. That will never change. Hannah nodded, but the words didn't seem to soothe her the way they once had. She appreciated the love Alice and Mark gave her, but the feeling of being different from everyone else was becoming too heavy to ignore. Meanwhile, Ethan began retreating into himself. He spent more time playing his guitar, pouring his emotions into the music. But even the music, which used to bring him peace, couldn't erase the pain he felt every time he saw people whispering behind his back, or giving him that look, the look that said, "You don't belong." Despite the external challenges, Hannah and Ethan continued to grow in love and support from their family. Alice and Mark stood by them, unwavering, determined to protect them from the prejudices of the world. But the triplets were no longer children. They were growing up, and the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. They would have to find their own way to reconcile the love of their family with the harshness of a world that couldn't see beyond skin color. And it wouldn't be easy. In the next part of their journey, Hannah and Ethan will have to confront the weight of their identity and come to terms with the prejudice they face. Will their love for each other and their family be enough to overcome the challenges ahead? Or will the world outside prove too powerful to ignore? Searching for the truth. Who are our real parents? As Hannah and Ethan entered their late teens, they began to feel the heavy weight of unanswered questions hanging over their heads. The memories of their childhood, filled with love and security, were tempered by the shadow of their unknown past. Both had always known they were adopted, but as they grew older, the need to understand why their biological parents had abandoned them became an undeniable part of their journey. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a deep, gnawing desire to understand their origins, the reasons behind their rejection. They knew their adoptive parents, Alice and Mark, loved them unconditionally, but the questions about their birth parents had grown too large to ignore. Why had John and Emily Foster abandoned them? What had led to that decision? And most importantly, who were these people who shared their blood but had chosen to turn their backs on them? Ethan was the first to bring up the subject one evening after dinner. They were sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset, a quiet calm settling over them, but the silence between them was heavy. I can't keep ignoring it, Hannah, Ethan said, breaking the stillness. His voice was hesitant but firm. We need to know why they left us. I need to understand. Hannah looked at him, her eyes filled with the same conflicted emotions. I've been thinking about it too. But where do we even start? Ethan paused, considering her words. Maybe we should start by looking for them. I don't know about you, but I need answers. We need to know who they are, why they left us, and if there's any chance of understanding why we weren't enough. Hannah felt a lump form in her throat. She had been avoiding this moment for so long, but now, faced with Ethan's determination, she realized that the time had come. Let's do it, she said quietly. Let's find them. The decision to find their biological parents was not an easy one. It meant confronting the painful reality of being abandoned, of facing the truth about the people who had given them life, but not the love they so desperately needed. But it was a step they both knew they had to take. The search began in earnest the following week. After days of searching online and digging through records, they realized they needed help. They weren't sure where to start looking for their parents or how to uncover information that had been buried for so many years. It wasn't something they could do alone, not without access to resources or information they didn't have. That's when Sandra, a local journalist who had been investigating adoption cases and family histories for years, came into the picture. Hannah and Ethan had heard of Sandra through a mutual acquaintance, someone who had been involved in other adoption searches. Sandra's reputation as a meticulous researcher and her knowledge of tracking down elusive information made her the perfect person to assist them. They met Sandra at a small cafe, and within minutes, it was clear she was not only incredibly professional, but also deeply empathetic. Sandra listened attentively as the twins explained their story, the pain they had carried for so long, and their desire to understand their past. She immediately understood the gravity of their request. "I can help," Sandra said, her voice calm yet filled with determination. "It won't be easy, but I'll help you find the information you need. I'll dig through old records, contact the hospital, and see what I can find about your birth parents." The twins exchanged hopeful glances. This was the first time they had felt like they might actually get the answers they were searching for. As Sandra began her investigation, Hannah and Ethan found themselves grappling with a mix of emotions. There was hope, of course, the hope that they would finally get answers. But there was also fear of what they might find. What if their birth parents didn't want to meet them? What if they had moved on with their lives, leaving them with nothing but the painful memories of abandonment? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he might not be ready for the emotional toll the search would take. But he knew, deep down, that it was something he couldn't ignore any longer. He had to know the truth. "I'm scared," Hannah admitted one night as they sat in the living room together, flipping through old photos of their childhood. "What if they don't want us? What if they don't even care about us?" Ethan looked at her, his face serious. "I get it, but we can't live the rest of our lives wondering. We need to know who they are. We need to know why they left us, no matter how painful it is." Hannah nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She knew Ethan was right, but the fear of rejection still lingered. Despite all the love she had in her life, the truth of their abandonment had never fully faded. She wasn't sure how much more of it she could handle. Days passed, and the weight felt excruciating. But then, one afternoon, Sandra called them with news. She had managed to track down information about their birth parents. She had found the names, John and Emily Foster, and had even located their last known address in Charleston. Hannah's hands shook as she held the phone. The information was like a bolt of lightning, striking her with both shock and anticipation. For the first time, they had real names, real people to confront. "That's them," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "John and Emily Foster. Those are our real parents." Sandra's voice came through the phone, steady and professional. "I've also found their contact information. You can write to them, request a meeting. But I'll be honest with you. This could be difficult. People change over the years. They may not want to meet you, or they might not have the answers you're hoping for. But I've done everything I can to help you get to this point." And Ethan and Hannah were speechless for a moment. The weight of the decision settled in. Should they reach out? Should they face the parents who had left them all those years ago? But then Hannah took a deep breath. "We have to know. We need to hear it from them." Ethan nodded. "We need to understand why." The next day, they sat together at the kitchen table, pen and paper in hand. Writing the letter to John and Emily Foster was both cathartic and painful. They poured their hearts into the letter, asking for the truth. Why had they been abandoned? What had led to that heartbreaking decision? They signed the letter together, as if to symbolize their unity in this journey toward the truth. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Foster," the letter began. "We are Hannah and Ethan, the twins you gave birth to 18 years ago. We are writing to you because we want to understand why you left us behind. We've spent our lives wondering who you are and what happened. We deserve to know the truth." They sent the letter with a mixture of fear and anticipation, knowing that it might change everything. Confronting the past. A meeting with the Fosters. Hannah and Ethan stood in front of the Fosters' modest home, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The journey that had started with a simple search for their biological parents had now led them to this moment, a meeting they had both dreamed of and feared for years. They could feel the weight of the 18 years of unanswered questions, the 18 years of abandonment, and the 18 years of wondering what could have been if their biological parents had chosen them. Sandra, the journalist who had helped them uncover the truth, had advised them to take it slow, but neither of the twins had ever been one to back down from what they wanted. They had already been through so much. This was just one more challenge in their long, difficult journey toward understanding their true selves. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, his voice low and filled with nerves. Hannah nodded, but her stomach churned with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for this, but we have to do it." They had decided to meet John and Emily Foster, their birth parents, in person. The letter they had sent months ago had finally reached them. The Fosters had agreed to meet, but neither side knew what to expect. Would there be an apology? Would there be anger, tears, or silence? The door to the house creaked open, and there stood John and Emily. Their faces were weathered with age and uncertainty, just as Hannah and Ethan had imagined. John, in his early 50s, stood tall, his eyes betraying a mixture of guilt and fear. Emily, on the other hand, looked fragile, as if she had aged years in the short time since they'd last seen her children. "Hello," Hannah said, her voice shaky as she stepped forward. She was no longer the little girl they had abandoned, but standing before them now. Her emotions were raw. We're your children." There was a long pause, and then Emily's face crumpled. She took a hesitant step forward, reaching out as if she might touch them, but quickly pulled back, uncertain of what was allowed. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I can't believe it's you." Ethan stepped forward, his heart racing, but his voice steady. "You left us 18 years ago. Why?" John swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. He seemed to be trying to form words, but was too lost in the weight of the moment to speak. Emily, too, struggled to find the right words. I didn't know what to do, Emily finally whispered. You were nothing like us. I thought I couldn't handle it. Her voice cracked and her eyes welled up with tears. I couldn't bear the thought of what people would say. I couldn't imagine raising children that didn't look like me. The twins were stunned. The truth they had been searching for now laid bare before them. Ethan's face hardened. So, you abandoned us just because we didn't look like you? John's face flushed red, a mix of anger and shame taking over his features. We were afraid of what people would think, afraid of how we would be judged. We were weak. I thought if I just ignored it, maybe it would go away. Hannah felt the weight of their words, but she couldn't hold back the hurt anymore. You didn't even give us a chance. You didn't even try. You signed those papers and walked away from us without a second thought. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she stepped back. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Her voice trembled with guilt. I don't know what I was thinking. We were selfish. We didn't know how to raise you. It was a cowardly decision. I regretted every single day. Hannah could feel the rage building up inside her. But a small part of her, an old part of her, still yearned for the connection, for the family that could have been. But the pain was too deep. Ethan stood beside her, silent, his arms crossed, his expression cold. You can't take back what you did, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. We grew up without you. We had a family who loved us. But it wasn't you. It was never you. And now I don't know what to feel. The silence that followed was suffocating. Both parents stood there, their faces painted with regret and sorrow. There was nothing left to say. The years they had lost were too many, but still, they had to try. John finally spoke, his voice soft and uncertain. Is there any chance you can forgive us? We want to be a part of your lives now. Hannah shook her head slowly. Forgiveness doesn't come that easy. Ethan stepped forward, his hand on his sister's shoulder. It's not about forgiveness, he said. It's about understanding. You were supposed to protect us. You were supposed to love us, but you didn't. The weight of the conversation hung between them like a wall that no one could break through. There was no magic reconciliation, no immediate forgiveness. There were just two sets of people, broken and lost in their own worlds, trying to make sense of a past that they could never change. But in the end, it wasn't the words that would heal the wound. It was time. It was the willingness to listen, to try to rebuild something that was lost. As the meeting came to an end, the twins turned to leave, their hearts heavy, but their resolve strong. They had heard the truth. They had confronted the ghosts of their past. And though the answers were painful, they had finally begun the process of understanding. Goodbye, Hannah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. We'll figure this out on our own. As they walked away, John and Emily stood in the doorway, watching their children disappear into the distance, both haunted by the choices they had made and the love they had left behind. The story of their abandonment was not over, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance for healing, for Hannah, Ethan, and even for the Fosters. The journey to forgiveness, whether given or received, was just beginning. Healing and forgiveness, accepting and letting go of the past. It had been several weeks since Hannah and Ethan had confronted their biological parents, John and Emily Foster. The rawness of that meeting, The truth they had uncovered was still fresh in their minds, yet something in them had begun to shift. It was as if the weight of the unanswered questions had finally been lifted, but it left a new burden, one that was even more difficult to bear. Hannah lay awake one night, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The anger, the hurt, the sense of abandonment, it all swirled in her heart like a storm she couldn't escape. But in the midst of it, she found a quiet thought. What if holding on to all of this pain only hurt her in the end? Ethan was lying in the bed next to her, his back turned as he stared at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the soft light coming through the window, but the silence between them was loud. "Hannah!" Ethan's voice cut through the stillness. She turned to him, her heart already sensing what was coming. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own internal struggle. "The anger, it eats at me every day. The Fosters didn't deserve what we did to them, but it's like we've been carrying this weight for years, and it's crushing me." Hannah turned on her side, facing her brother. She could see the pain in his eyes, the same pain that had followed them both since they were abandoned. "You're right," she whispered. "I keep thinking if I just hold on to it, maybe I'll get the answers I need. But the truth is, we're never going to get that from them. They've made their choices, and so have we." Ethan's eyes softened. "I don't think we need their forgiveness. I think we need to let go of the hate we've been holding on to. We've been stuck in the past for too long." The words hung in the air, resonating with Hannah like a quiet truth that was finally ready to be acknowledged. The anger they had carried for so long, anger toward their birth parents, toward their abandonment, toward the world that had never truly accepted them, was slowly being replaced with a different feeling. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the mistakes of the Fosters or forgetting what had happened. It was about letting go of the pain, about freeing themselves from the grip of the past so they could live their lives without carrying that weight. "I don't know if I can forgive them," Hannah murmured, her voice full of vulnerability. "But I think it's time to stop holding on to the past." Ethan nodded slowly. "Me too. I've been so angry, but that's not who I want to be anymore. We can't change what happened, but we can change how we live moving forward." As the words settled in their hearts, they both knew this was the beginning of their healing. Forgiveness was never going to be easy, but it was the only way they could truly move on. While Hannah and Ethan were beginning to understand the power of forgiveness, they weren't the only ones affected by the truth of their past. Alice and Mark Miller, their adoptive parents, had spent years loving these two children as their own, and the revelation of their biological parents' rejection was as heartbreaking for them as it was for the twins. Alice had been the one who held them in her arms for the first time, who whispered lullabies as they fell asleep, and who had stayed up countless nights worrying about their futures. Mark had always been the steady, loving presence, guiding them through the ups and downs of life. Now they had to come to terms with the fact that their children's pain ran deeper than they had realized. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Alice could no longer hold her emotions in. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I can't believe they did that to you, to both of you." She wiped a tear from her cheek and looked across the table at Hannah and Ethan. "You didn't deserve that. No child should ever feel that kind of rejection." Mark reached over and took her hand, his expression one of quiet strength. "We'll be here for them, always." Hannah and Ethan exchanged a glance. They had seen the pain in their parents' eyes, but they also knew the love that had always been there. "Mom," "Dad," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm, "we don't blame you for what happened. We don't expect you to fix it." Hannah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You've always been there for us. You've given us love, security, and a family. That's what matters." Alice and Mark both smiled through their tears, grateful for the understanding and maturity their children had shown. It was a moment of healing, a moment where the walls that had been built around their hearts, walls made of fear, anger, and hurt, finally began to come down. "I wish we could have done more," Alice whispered, squeezing both their hands. "You've done more than enough," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "You've given us everything we ever needed." Hannah's voice broke, but it was a voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for being our family." Alice and Mark's hearts swelled with pride as they pulled their children into a tight embrace. The love they shared was unconditional, and it had been tested. But in this moment, they knew that no matter what their past had been, they were a family bound by choice, not by blood. And that choice, their choice to love, to accept, to support, was the most powerful thing they had ever done. As the days passed, the pain from the past slowly began to fade. For Hannah and Ethan, the forgiveness they had granted to their birth parents didn't make everything magically right, but it gave them peace. The weight of the rejection, the abandonment, and the questions that had once haunted them no longer had the power to control their lives. They still carried the scars, but now they understood that those scars didn't define who they were. They were stronger than they had ever realized. As they worked through their emotions, they found new ways to bond with their family. Ethan began to express himself through his art, creating pieces that spoke to his inner journey and his newfound sense of peace. Hannah began writing, channeling her thoughts and feelings into stories of hope and survival. And together, they shared a renewed connection, one built on trust, love, and the understanding that family wasn't always about biology. It was about the people who chose to stay. Alice and Mark, too, found themselves growing even closer to their children. The journey they had all been on, one that had tested their hearts, their resolve, and their love, had shaped them into a family that was more resilient than ever. And as the years went on, they faced the world not as separate pieces, but as a whole, stronger unit. The world may have questioned them. They may have faced challenges from society, from those who couldn't see beyond appearances. But within the walls of their home, they had found a sanctuary, a place where love ruled, where forgiveness healed, and where family was defined by the hearts that beat together. Rebuilding identity, family unity. As Hannah and Ethan entered their teenage years, the questions about who they were, their identity, and their place in the world began to surface with even more intensity. It had always been there, the awareness that they didn't look like their adoptive parents, that their skin color was different, that their story was different. But now, those questions were no longer about fitting in or pleasing others. They were about finding themselves, about understanding their uniqueness, and about finally stepping into the truth of who they were. One evening, while sitting together in the quiet comfort of their living room, Hannah looked over at Ethan, the flickering light from the television casting shadows across their faces. "You ever wonder, Ethan," she began, her voice thoughtful, "why we're different? Why our skin color doesn't match theirs? I mean, does it even matter anymore?" Ethan shifted his gaze from the TV to his sister. "I think we've spent enough time wondering about what makes us different," he said slowly, as if the weight of the question had been with him for years. "But maybe it's time we start owning it. Like, really owning who we are. We're not other anymore, Han. We're not the adopted ones. We're just us. And that's enough." Hannah paused, her heart swelling with a sense of pride. She had always been the one who struggled with the differences, the stares, the whispers, the uncomfortable questions. But what Ethan said struck a chord with her. He was right. It was time for them to stop seeing themselves through the lens of what the world expected them to be and start embracing the truth of who they were. They were proud of their heritage, proud of the family that had chosen them, proud of the fact that they were their own people with their own story to tell. No longer did they feel the need to justify themselves or explain the complexities of their past. They were both strong individuals, and the world's judgments didn't have the power to define them anymore. It was a moment of self-realization, a moment where they shed the last remnants of doubt and fully accepted who they were. Different, yes, but also undeniably special. With their new sense of self, Hannah and Ethan began to excel in different areas of their lives. They no longer let the questions and the prejudice get in the way of their potential. They were no longer fighting for acceptance. They were fighting for their dreams, and nothing could stop them. Hannah, who had always been a bright student, pushed herself even further. She joined the school's debate team, where she found her voice, speaking out on issues that mattered to her. Her eloquence, her passion for social justice, and her ability to command attention made her one of the most respected students in her class. She even began to consider a future in law or activism, inspired by the way her own story could make a difference in the world. Ethan, on the other hand, found solace in sports. Basketball became his escape, his way to channel the emotions he had carried with him for years. His natural talent and determination caught the attention of coaches, and before long, he was playing varsity in high school. But it wasn't just his physical abilities that set him apart. It was his work ethic, his leadership on and off the court, and his ability to inspire his teammates. He learned to use his past, his struggles, and his unique perspective as fuel to push himself further, and it paid off. Together, they became the embodiment of resilience. The whispers, the stares, the doubts, they faded into the background as they moved forward. They were no longer the adopted children struggling to find a place in a world that didn't understand them. They were Hannah and Ethan Carter, individuals with their own identity, their own dreams, and a powerful sense of self. They no longer saw their differences as weaknesses. They saw them as strengths. Every challenge they had faced, every obstacle that had been placed in their way, had only made them stronger. They had learned that their story was theirs to tell, and nothing, no one could take that away from them. Throughout all of this, one thing remained constant: their family. Alice and Mark Miller had always been their rock, supporting them, loving them unconditionally. And now, more than ever, their bond with their adoptive parents was unbreakable. Alice and Mark had been the ones to raise them, to give them love when they had no one else. They were the parents who had shown them what it meant to be truly loved, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. They had stood by them through the good times and the hard times. And now, as their children grew into young adults, they continued to stand by them, more proud than ever. "Do you ever feel like we're different, Mom?" Ethan asked one night, after a game, his tired body resting on the couch next to Alice. Alice smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Honey, we're all different. And that's exactly what makes this family so special. We didn't choose you because of what you look like. We chose you because of who you are. And that's all that matters." Mark, who was sitting across from them, chimed in. "That's right. There's no you or us. There's just we. We're in this together, always." Hannah sat next to her brother, a sense of peace settling over her. For so long, she had searched for answers, for a place where she could truly belong. She had questioned who she was, why she looked the way she did, and whether she was enough. But now, sitting here with her family, she realized that they had always been enough. They had always belonged, and they had always been loved. No matter how the world looked at them, no matter what labels others tried to place on them, they were a family built on love, not blood. A family that had overcome every obstacle, every hardship, and come out stronger. They stood together, side by side, united by the unbreakable bond that tied them together. They knew that the world would always have its opinions. The questions would continue, the looks would come, and the whispers would never fully disappear. But as long as they had each other, nothing else mattered. Together, they could face anything. And as the days turned into years, Hannah and Ethan realized that they were not defined by their past, by their skin color, or by the circumstances of their birth. They were defined by the love they had received and the love they gave. They were a family who had stood together, fought together, and built a life that was uniquely their own. In the end, they knew one thing for sure: they were enough. The future and hope, finding love and acceptance. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden glow across the quiet living room. The air was calm, filled with the warmth of togetherness. Hannah and Ethan sat side by side on the couch, their heads resting against their adoptive parents, Alice and Mark. The past few years had been filled with turbulence and uncertainty. But now, in this moment, there was peace. They had faced the truth about their origins. They had confronted their birth parents, asked the difficult questions, and walked away with answers that had not been easy to hear. But in doing so, they had found clarity about who they were, about where they came from, and most importantly, about who they were becoming. It wasn't just about the truth of their biological parents anymore. It was about the love that had surrounded them from the beginning, the love that had helped them grow, heal, and thrive. It was about the unwavering support of Alice and Mark, who had been their parents from the moment they had arrived, regardless of blood or skin color. And it was about the strength they had found in each other, as siblings and as a family. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but filled with awe as he looked at Hannah. Hannah smiled, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "All the time. We've been through so much, but here we are, together, and that's all that matters." The future that lay ahead was still uncertain, and they knew there would be more challenges to come. But they also knew that the love they shared was strong enough to face whatever came their way. They had already faced their past and emerged stronger because of it. Now, they were ready to take on the world, side by side. As the months passed, the quiet, steady rhythm of their lives became a comforting constant. Hannah and Ethan continued to excel in their passions, carving out their futures with determination and focus. Ethan, now a rising star on the basketball team, had been offered a scholarship to a prestigious college, a dream he had worked tirelessly for. Hannah, with her passion for social justice, had become involved in community activism and was planning to study law. But more than just their accomplishments, it was the quiet moments they cherished. The dinners around the table with Alice and Mark, the late-night talks about their dreams and fears, the laughter that filled their home. These were the moments that grounded them, that reminded them that they were, and always would be, loved. The world outside still carried its judgments, and society's expectations would always be there, but they had found something greater. Their place in a family that had chosen them not because of what they looked like, but because of who they were. And for the first time, they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and orange as the sun set, Hannah turned to Alice and Mark, who were seated beside them. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion, "for choosing us, for showing us what it really means to be loved." Alice reached over, brushing a tear from Hannah's cheek. "You've always been our children, Hannah. From the moment we saw you, you were ours. We don't need blood to define that. We need love." Ethan nodded, his eyes misty as he looked at the family that had given him everything. "We've found our home," he said simply. "We've found where we belong." And then as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, they all sat in silence, knowing that the hardest part was behind them. They had found peace, not just within themselves, but in each other. The past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. What defined them now was the love that had carried them through, the bond that would always tie them together, no matter where life took them. As the story came to a close, it was clear that Hannah and Ethan had overcome more than just abandonment. They had overcome the pain of being rejected, of feeling unwanted, of searching for a place to belong. They had found that place in the hearts of Alice and Mark Miller, in the embrace of a family that didn't need to be related by blood to be real. The message of their journey was clear. Love is not defined by blood. It is defined by choice, by care, by the actions we take for the people who matter most to us. Hannah and Ethan were no longer the abandoned children they once were. They were strong, capable individuals who had discovered their worth, their strength, and their place in the world. They had learned that family is not about who leaves you, but who stays, who fights for you, and who chooses to love you no matter what. And as they moved forward, the future stretched out before them, full of endless possibilities. They were no longer bound by the pain of their past, but driven by the hope of their future, together as a family, forever.